This is the Daily Medical News by MD Edge, where we bring you the top stories in clinical medicine, followed by a deeper dive into the day's top story. Today is Monday, November 18th. I'm the voice of MD Edge Podcasts, Nick Andrews. All of the stories you hear today are available in their full written forms via links in the show notes. Coming up later, a closer look at the best ways to make sure vaccines aren't costing your practice too much money. But first, we'd like to ask for your help in making this podcast better. Please take a moment to complete our short listener survey by following a link in the show notes. Questions include a little bit about you and a little bit about what kind of podcast material you like. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and of course, the survey is completely anonymous. And now, the top stories in clinical medicine. We begin today with unanimous FDA panel backing for a new indication for icosapent ethyl. That indication is for reducing cardiovascular event risk. Icosapent ethyl received FDA approval back in 2012 for the indication of cutting triglyceride levels once they reached at least 500 milligrams. The majority of data from the advisory panel comes from the Reduce It trial, which tested icosapent ethyl in more than 8,100 patients who had either established cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and at least one additional cardiovascular disease risk factor. The study showed that patients who received icosapent ethyl had a 25% relative risk reduction in the trial's primary composite endpoint. Despite the panel agreeing that icosapent ethyl should receive some type of indication for cardiovascular event reduction, they also split over which patients the indication should include, specifically over primary prevention. Clinicians who manage these types of patients viewed the prospect of expanded indication for icosapent ethyl as an important advance. And an analysis of the cost-effectiveness of icosapent ethyl as it was used in the Reduce It trial showed that the drug fell into the rare category of being a dominant treatment. That means that it had both improved patient outcomes and reduced medical costs. And HealthCare.gov enrollment is down this year. The Federal Health Insurance Exchange is now through the first 2 weeks of its 2020 open enrollment on HealthCare.gov, and just under 1 million plans have been selected. This is according to updated data from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Nearly 700,000 of the selections were made by consumers who were renewing their existing coverage, while the rest came from new consumers who did not have coverage from an exchange in 2019. The total number of plans selected through week 2 is down almost 21% from last year when selections totaled nearly 1.2 million. This year, the first week of open enrollment was only 2 days long, while it was 3 days long last year. And this year, Nevada has its own state-based healthcare exchange, and so Nevadans will not be participating in HealthCare.gov. CMS noted that the total number of plans selected during a particular reporting period can change later if plans are modified or canceled, and that the weekly snapshot only reports new plan selections and active renewals, and it does not report the number of consumers who have paid premiums to effectuate their enrollment. It's time now for an update on EVALI, which is the acronym for Vaping-linked lung injuries. The CDC reported that there have been 2,172 cases of EVALI from every U.S. state except Alaska, as well as the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Researchers also reported that there have been 42 confirmed deaths in 24 states and the District of Columbia. These data were up to date as of the CDC report on November 12, 2019. Laboratory test results of bronchoalveolar lavage fluid samples from 29 patients submitted to the CDC from 10 states found vitamin E acetate in all of the samples. This is the first time a chemical of concern has been found in biologic samples from patients with EVALI. These findings provide direct evidence of vitamin E acetate at the primary site of injury within the lungs. THC was identified in 82% of the samples, and nicotine was identified in 62% of the samples. Testing continues for other chemicals, including plant oils, petroleum distillates like mineral oil, medium-chain triglycerides oil, and terpenes, which are compounds commonly found in or added to THC products. None of these chemicals has been detected in the bronchoalveolar lavage fluid samples that have been tested. For more information, please click on the link to this story in the show notes. In the story, there are resources available for the public, for healthcare professionals, and for state and local health departments. The Daily Medical News will be right back after this. Welcome back to the Daily Medical News by MD Edge. I am Nick Andrews. Adults who are worried about dementia are far more likely to do crossword puzzles and take fish oil than they are to talk to their doctor about risk. This is according to the results of a survey published as a research letter in JAMA Neurology. In the study, researchers surveyed more than 1,000 adults who were between the ages of 50 and 64 years old. The majority of participants self-reported that they were in good or excellent physical health and good or excellent mental health. More than half had annual incomes of $60,000 or higher. About one-third reported having no college education of any kind. 753 participants were white, 101 were Hispanic, and 93 were black. In the study, researchers report that more than half of the participants reported using crossword puzzles as a memory exercise. However, only 5% said they spoke with their physicians about how to reduce risk. Ironically, this lack of communication was also associated with buying unproven over-the-counter memory supplements while still remaining ignorant of proven ways to head off dementia and other contributing chronic conditions. About 32% of respondents reported using fish oil or omega-3 fatty acids, and about 33% reported using vitamins or supplements. A multivariate analysis found that black respondents were about half as likely to believe they would develop dementia compared with whites, which is contrary to epidemiologic findings that blacks are more likely than whites to develop dementia. People who have reported fair or poor mental health were more than twice as likely to feel dementia was in their future, but fair or poor physical health was not significantly associated with the concern for developing dementia. And finally today, an expert analysis on how to make sure vaccine administration doesn't put your practice in financial harm. Chip Hart is director of the Pediatric Solutions Consulting Group at the Physicians Computer Company. Speaking at the 2019 annual meeting of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Mr. Hart said that your practice will fail if immunizations are not paid. Mr. Hart had two main pieces of advice to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. The first is to calculate what he called carrying costs and then apply those costs to the cost of your vaccines. The second is to make sure that you join an effectively managed, effective group purchasing organization. The American Academy of Pediatrics created two documents that provide clear-cut guidance on the impact that vaccine delivery has on your bottom line. Those documents are available in the original story, which you can find via the show notes. Mr. Hart said that based on data from his clients, vaccines have grown from 13% of an average pediatric practice's revenue in 2003 to 22% in 2018. He also referenced AAP data that shows pediatricians need to generate between 17 and 28% more than what you paid for the vaccine simply to break even. That's to cover the administrative overhead required to purchase and store the product in an office-based refrigerator and the staff time to administer it. These are the, quote, carrying costs he mentioned. There are two ways to go about determining your vaccine product overhead. The first is to perform an in-depth analysis of your costs, including time studies and cost accounting. For example, if your hazardous waste costs are $3,500 per year and half of the material is composed of vaccine waste, that leaves $1,750. This number is divided by the number of vaccines you gave last year, and it adds up over time. Alternatively, you can use the research from the American Academy of Pediatrics to presume that you need to have a margin of 17% to 28% on your product. He says, use a figure like 20% or 25% because it's likely as accurate as any analysis a busy private practice is capable of doing, and you can immediately determine if you are in the profitability ballpark. Mr. Hart advises practices operating in the red to review their vaccine delivery workflow, to look for leaks, to use proper administrative codes, and to negotiate the price of vaccine products with payers. Implementing effective inventory management is also key. Mr. Hart said that he has worked with too many practices where flu shots go missing. Staff take them home or bring them to their friends after hours. He said you should be able to generate an inventory report out of your practice management system. You can also generate a report probably out of your EHR. And that concludes this edition of the Daily Medical News by MD Edge. I am Nick Andrews. You can, of course, find links to each of these stories in the podcast notes. We'll be back on Tuesday with the top stories in clinical medicine.